the things that I sort of wanted to touch on, it's, like I mentioned, AI has been around for a very long time. For example, many decades ago, I was playing with rule-based models, and they're still around and they're actually quite viable for particular applications. But one of the challenges that we run into now is that unlike a lot of the programming and so on in the past, where you were very explicit and very specific in terms of what the results were going to be, in other words, you do ABC, you'll get XYZ. With the neural network machine learning, we're talking about percentages. And while if the percentages are high, above 80%, you typically have something that's going to be worthwhile using. But if you're going to be in an application space where security or safety or other things are going to come into play, then you have to be much more careful on how you're going to be using these things, especially if there's liability involved. So, what do you think about those kinds of issues? How are people are looking at them? Because, yes, I can make something that can generate an image that's very good. I can have something that's going to recognize some text that I've written and give me some responses to it. But how important is it that those results are going to be accurate?
I'll take a stab at that. I am less schooled in the mechanics of how it works. I'll leave that to you, absolutely, Bill, and to Len and to Anna. I know you're fundies at that. For me, it is looking at, as I said, perhaps more surface level, looking at what applications are out there. But when you're talking about security, I recently spoke with someone from Universal Robot, Anders Beck. So I believe he's their VP of technology. And they are working on a bunch of applications. And for me, it's interesting when he broke down the types of application examples, and I'll get into one or two of those maybe, how the data quality is so important for them, and how the AI learns about its I guess the space that it's in. So the way I would characterize their work is to say that they are creating AI power tools for robotics and for automation applications. So I believe they're making headway at normalizing AI in manufacturing. I do believe that for manufacturing, for packaging, for logistics, from the examples that he shared with me. So they've shown that not all applications need to be complete systems, that not all applications need a complete systems overhaul. And there are many supporting applications for small or lightweight applications where small, medium enterprises can get started. And it raises a question about, security in that case, because, who's safeguarding and what framework are they doing this in? That's where my brain goes to when I think about how the general population, other than large enterprises with large budgets, are able to access some of the lower hanging fruit in AI technologies and in a safe manner.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about how generative AI is being used in the field, again, specifically for controls programming. And I will say most people are just experimenting with it at this stage, but many of them have found it to be very useful. So it is possible to use a large language model or an LLM for controls programming, but it will require, a highly trained model. A controls engineer can't just jump on ChatGPT or one of the other ones and necessarily find that useful. There are programming applications that will work with that kind of more traditional programming language generally, but for controls programming, you'll need to really train that LLM with, huge quantities of code examples, code documentation, even kind of just plain English descriptions of the desired functionality that you're trying to achieve. It could need to be further fine-tuned for the specific vendor platform or the communication protocol that's being used. So there's no out-of-the-box solution right now, and it's definitely a process to train these models. But there are many who are experimenting and, have found it useful for different programming functions. Kind of automated repetitive coding tasks is something it can be very useful for. Automating that documentation that goes with the coding, or after you have your coding done, kind of using it for error detection or debugging and kind of optimizing your code. Sometimes an integrator will come into an already existing project and they're either, retrofitting an existing setup or taking over a project from another company. And so they have to sometimes go in there and reverse engineer code to kind of understand what's going on. And that can be very tedious, again, if you don't have a lot of that proper documentation. So large language models can help a lot in that facet. From the integrators that I've been talking to, their younger engineers really do use it, and it's really a great training tool for them to, practice their current programming skills and sort of help expand their knowledge on new languages as well.
Now, Anna, one of the things you mentioned before was utilizing LLMs to essentially analyze existing programs that you may not necessarily have some documentation on. I actually
Right.
want to take a little further in another direction, in the sense that once you generate, your application and you've incorporated machine learning into it, how are you potentially managing that? So when you move on to your next iteration or so on, whether or not you can build on what you actually have. In particular, part of the big challenge right now with AI is understanding what it's actually doing. If you look at it as a black box, you put things in, you put some training in, you get some responses out, that's going to be interesting. But if you're going to have to improve that or move that into a new environment, it's not just how you're plugging these things together, but how did it work before? And do you still have that information? And along those lines, what model did you build on? What data did you start with? And how is that potentially going to change down the line? Because, and do you own that? That's a big question in terms of, people building these models based upon tools that are coming from third parties that are working with third parties that are working with third parties.
Yeah, that's interesting in terms of the ownership. I haven't really thought about that a lot. Although, I will say I think just in terms of cost, building these things are very expensive. I think, as you said, there are companies that are sort of selling their models that you can then take and integrate. But yeah, that's a big question, and it's a whole industry that's developing right now. One thing I can talk a little bit about, and sort of in terms of where you take your models and how you build it, is sort of some of the basics of how you're training it. And you're using something called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. So this is another AI framework that works with an LLM to sort of make it more accurate and relevant. And it's something that kind of works on a continuous process. So that's how you're sort of taking that foundation and kind of building on top of it from there. So essentially, this RAG can sort of take your LLM prompt and search external data sources. So whatever you give it, if we're talking about a factory or plant, that could be your asset data and all your sensor data, whatever documentation you want to give it. It can be other sources out there, wherever you're sort of pointing that. It can pre-process all that information, then kind of rewrite that prompt before it goes to the LLM, to sort of make it a little bit more accurate. You know, when you're talking about LLMs, sometimes they're great, and sometimes they can spit stuff out where it doesn't make any sense at all. You're thinking, what? And so, they don't really understand language in the way that we do. A large language model only understand language in terms of how words relate to each other statistically. So they don't really understand what words mean contextually. So RAG is something that can supplement an LLM with those external sources to, make it sound like it knows more what it's talking about. But it's still a guide, as always, I think, and no one is taking this, as it comes out.
Hey Bill, we actually have already seen businesses and future businesses that kind of play off of or build on top of other people's data already. So I'm kind of confident that at some point this whole AI, because it is valid. I mean, it's a valid point, like who will own these things. But if you take the big example would be Uber built on top of Google data, so it's been worked out in other areas. I'm sure as time goes on, we'll work that out. But I think it's a concern for everybody. I hear all the time about how, it is easy to build a pilot. It's hard to scale it up
Mm-hmm.
and form partnerships and move on. So I think we're still at everybody's looking to build a pilot right now. So,
Well, you actually run into another challenge that, on software and embedded systems we hit all the time. And that is essentially locking down your software to a particular version.
mhm,
Challenges of moving from that version up to the next one, because you may be jumping 10 years in the future. How is
mhm.
that going to affect all that training that you may have done, or the model that you may have used has been changing over time? Those are significant things that I don't think a lot of people have experience with at this point because it hasn't been around that long.
There's, of course, a big company like Siemens, right? That with their industrial co-pilot, which incidentally won this year's Hermes Award at Hannover Messe, it tells you that it's created an entirely different business model once again, so that if you're concerned about not staying up to date, if you are have the capability to use their system or their accelerated program or their what they call it, whatever the industrial AI driven co-pilot system is called, then you're presumably you're staying up to date with all of the updates. But to my mind, that could also be very costly.
Well, not only could it be costly, but it could cause havoc. For example, you don't necessarily know what has been added to a system and how it potentially affects your system that you've integrated it with, unless you have some level of testing and verification along the way. And you can potentially wind up with significant problems. We run into this in software all the time, where people are using libraries out there that are coming from a third party. And if a bug gets introduced, or worse yet, a virus or something that gets introduced, and you're automatically pulling those things out and incorporating it into your design or implementation, those things are going to sneak in without you knowing about them. And then you really have a problem.
Yeah, I mean it's a legitimate concern. I mean, I don't think anybody can deny it is a scary thought. But um, I go back to, maybe I'm being a little Pollyannish here, but I just feel like they'll figure this out. Somebody will figure this out. Because if we're concerned about it now, we're not the only 4 people concerned about that in the industry.